I've spent over 3,000 hours and thousands of dollars testing pretty much every Chinese learning method you can think of. Now, some of these experiments were complete disasters that left me ready to quit Chinese forever. Others were so effective that they transformed not only my ability to speak and understand Chinese, but we also now use these in our courses and when training our private coaching clients. So after 13 years of brutal trial and error, we finally figured out what actually works and what is just kind of expensive procrastination disguised as learning. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through every single one of the 12 experiments that I've tried over these years, including the ones that failed miserably and the breakthroughs that changed everything. And by the end, you'll know exactly which methods to avoid and which ones will get you fluent faster than you ever thought possible. And if you'd like to skip all the painful trial and error that we went through and get straight to the methods that actually work, click the link in the description to join our free course and community. You'll gain access to the exact techniques, the exact process laid out for you that took us from nearly quitting to achieving fluency in Mandarin without all the frustration and failure. So my first experiment was actually, surprisingly, a very successful one. It works right from the beginning, even though I almost dismissed it as too simple. My very first experiment was with a listen repeat program called Pimsleur. This was pure listen repeat training, no textbooks, no characters, no grammar explanations, just audio. They say a Chinese phrase, I repeat it back. And we'd build conversations piece by piece. I spent about 100 hours when I was 19 years old, I remember it very clearly, going through their entire program over around 3 months or so. I did it on the way to work, the way back home from work, throughout my lunch hour. And here's what happened. After those 100 hours, this is before my first trip to China, I could actually have basic conversations in Chinese. And because I could communicate pretty smoothly despite such a small amount of practice, it made that first trip to China an absolutely incredible experience. My pronunciation was so good because I'd done so much listen repeat practice that I would constantly get compliments from native speakers. They'd stop mid-conversation and they would ask me, "How long have you been learning Chinese? You sound like a native speaker." This experiment taught me something pretty crucial that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Pronunciation is your crucial foundation. If you get it right pretty early on, everything else just becomes so much easier. And if you get it wrong, as in you avoid it or you get the wrong coaching for it, you'll spend years trying to fix bad habits that are deeply ingrained, right? So the listen and repeat method works because it trains your mouth muscles, just like native speakers of any language train their mouth muscles. And it also trains your brain to produce Chinese sounds correctly from day one. You're not just learning words or studying grammar. You are learning how to physically make the sounds of Chinese. You're developing muscle memory for tones and pronunciation patterns. But here's where I made a mistake. I thought this was all I needed. I got very overconfident and assumed that I'd cracked the code of Chinese learning and I was some kind of language learning genius. And that overconfidence led me straight into my next experiment, which was a complete disaster. So feeling confident from my pronunciation success, I decided to go all in on traditional Chinese learning. When I returned to China a few years later, I bought textbooks, I hired tutors, I enrolled in classes. I was going to learn Chinese the proper way, just like I learned French in school. We don't speak French. My first tutor was actually my wife, which I guess worked out great for my personal life. We ended up having 2 beautiful kids together. But in terms of Chinese education, yeah, disaster. We would spend hours together with me writing random characters over and over again, just sort of trusting the process until my hand was cramping. And I'd copy the same character 50 to 100 times, thinking somehow the repetition would make it stick. We would also just learn in a very haphazard kind of way, random vocabulary from textbooks. For example, one day I would learn a whole list of kitchen utensils, even though I don't like cooking. The next day, we'd learn about Tang Dynasty poems. And this is all before I could even talk about the weather and have a basic conversation properly, right? So this is where I learned that traditional methods, textbooks, classrooms, tutors, aren't just boring. They're often actively harmful to your progress. They teach you to think about Chinese like it's an academic subject that you need to study for a test, a series of facts that you need to memorize, where memorization is actually a relatively small part of becoming fluent in Chinese or any language. And the worst part was the complete lack of logic in how things were presented. So I'd learn the word for chrysanthemum, 菊花, before I'd learn how to say I believe or I think. I would study complex grammar patterns, like I call them grammar equations. This word plus this word equals this meaning. And this is all before I could even produce basic phrases comfortably and have a back and forth conversation. And after studying for a long time, I still couldn't actually use the grammar structure in real time. It often felt like I was trying to study or learn calculus before I could even do basic mathematics or arithmetic. The priorities just felt completely backward. So this experiment taught me that just because something feels like serious studying and you're consciously there actively trying to learn, it doesn't mean that it's actually effective, that it's actually leading to fluency. In fact, often the opposite is true. The more painful and tedious a learning method feels, often the less likely it is to actually work. So the logical next step for me after this failure was to drop the textbooks and instead experiment with a more modern approach, which turned out to be even more of a disaster. So this is the experiment that I'm personally most embarrassed about, but it taught me one of the most important lessons of my entire Chinese journey. So I discovered a website called memrise.com and became completely obsessed with it. It was the first time I used these kind of like digital flashcards, these spaced repetition software. I was spending 3 hours a day, every single day for 9 months straight. I racked up 16.5 million points on this platform. Yes, you heard that right, 16.5 million points. I learned thousands of words based on English definitions. I learned them individually. I had nearly 100% recall rates on every flashcard. And while I was learning with this, I felt like a machine. I was just crushing the metrics on the app. And I thought I was making incredible progress with the language. And then I tried to have a simple conversation with a Chinese person and it would all just come crashing down. I would freeze. I knew thousands of words in isolation, but I didn't know how to use them properly. I would actually get laughed at by my Chinese friends, just like looking at me like, what the heck are you on about? It was kind of like knowing every single part that makes up a car, but not knowing how to drive. So here's what was actually happening. Those thousands of words were just floating around in my brain with no connections, no context, no understanding of how they actually behave in real Chinese. I wasn't learning the language. I was memorizing a dictionary. So the moment I stopped reviewing those flashcards every single day, everything I'd learned started just disappearing. And within weeks, I'd forgotten most of what I'd learned because there was just no strong neural pathways, no real understanding of what I was learning, no foundation to build on. So this experiment shattered my confidence once again, but taught me two valuable lessons. Number one, flashcards are for reviewing, not for learning. And number two, recognition is not production. Very different things. So understanding a word when you see it is completely different from being able to use it correctly when you need it. So I was confusing activity with progress, effort with results. So just because I was working hard, didn't mean I was actually working smart. I was essentially doing the equivalent of reading a cookbook over and over again, expecting to become a chef without actually ever cooking anything. So after my flashcard disaster, I thought I figured out the problem because after all, I'd learned so many words, but I didn't know how to use them and how words are used. That's what grammar is, right? So I figured, hey, I need to learn grammar. So I need to learn it just the same way I did in school, the same way my tutors had taught me up to this point, consciously and systematically. So my next experiment was going through a website called All Set Learning Grammar Wiki and consciously studying every single Chinese grammar point that I could find. So I was writing out English definitions, trying to consciously figure out how words were used, in what order to create which meaning. I would spend, again, 2-3 hours a day for, I think, 2 months or so doing this. Every morning, I was making charts, I was taking notes, I was trying to memorize rules, saying them out loud in English, right? When to use le versus guo and ba constructions, how they work, and the difference between de and de. And I felt like I was just finally being serious about learning Chinese properly, right? And you know what? It felt good. It felt like I was really learning Chinese properly because I was working hard. And again, it felt good to study like that. It felt productive, academic. I was filling notebooks with grammar rules and explanation. I felt smart. I thought I was building a solid foundation of understanding, but this was obviously just another failure, right? So after 2 months of intensive grammar study, I tried to have a conversation again. And guess what? No improvement, right? I still couldn't speak naturally. In fact, it felt even more awkward as I was trying to consciously scan everything I was about to say out loud based on all my new grammar knowledge, making me hesitate even more, right? So all those grammar rules that I'd memorized consciously were completely useless, in fact, harmful when I actually needed to produce Chinese in real time. So here's what I learned from that experiment. Your conscious brain is pathetically weak compared to your subconscious brain. No offense, it applies to me too. When it comes to language processing, when it comes to language acquisition. So when you're having a conversation, you don't have time to think through grammar rules, right? And you shouldn't be doing that. You need patterns to become automatic, intuitive. So this experiment taught me that grammar can't be learned consciously through rules and explanations. I was trying to use my slow, analytical, conscious mind to do something that needed to be handled by my fast, pattern recognition subconscious mind. So think about trying to walk or breathe consciously by controlling every muscle movement instead of just letting your body do what it knows how to do naturally. So this failure led to my next experiment where I finally started listening to people who actually knew what they were talking about instead of listening to myself who didn't know what he was talking about. So by this point, I'd wasted over 1,000 hours learning Chinese, and I was seriously considering giving up on the language entirely. All right, I felt like that I was terrible at learning languages. I completely gone from this overconfident, arrogant kind of learner thinking I was some sort of genius to thinking absolutely, actually, I'm the opposite. I'm not very good at languages. I'm nowhere near as smart as I thought I was. Then I stumbled across a video by a guy called Stephen Krashen who talked about how we primarily learn languages through comprehensible input, basically understanding the language before we can speak it. And then it hit me, right? I couldn't actually understand Chinese, right? If I put on a TV show or a podcast or listen to a conversation, I could barely follow anything, right? So how could I expect to produce it? Right. So up until this point, I had refused to learn characters because of that negative experience with my wife, bless her. All that rote learning, that writing the characters over and over again, I saw learning to read as kind of a complete waste of time, right? But after watching Krashen's video, I had this humbling realization. Maybe I didn't know what was stupid and what wasn't. Maybe I didn't understand language learning as well as I thought. Maybe I, the guy who speaks one language, should stop listening to myself and start listening to the expert. So I went down a rabbit hole, and I guess you could say that was my next experiment, researching what polyglots actually do. Not necessarily scientists or linguistic researchers, but people that actually genuinely speak multiple languages fluently. What do they do to learn languages? And I found that they all had something crucial in common. They all emphasized the importance of understanding and getting a lot of reading and listening practice. And that's when I realized that I needed to learn to read Chinese fast. But I still didn't know how to learn characters effectively without that painful rote memorization that I'd experienced before, right? And that's where my next experiment completely changed the game. So after going down yet another rabbit hole about memory techniques, I stumbled across another video, a TED Talk about memory athletics, all about these people that can memorize hundreds of playing cards in perfect order or thousands of random numbers, right? The speaker wasn't some genius or savant. He was just a regular journalist who learned the memory techniques and became a memory champion within a year. And that's when I learned about memory palaces and how they could be applied to Chinese characters. Instead of writing characters hundreds of times hoping they'd stick, I started creating vivid mental movies for each character, right? I'd use people I knew and places that I'd been and objects I could visualize to represent every aspect of a character, its pronunciation, tone, meaning, visual structure, and the results were absolutely mind-blowing. Characters that used to take me hours to memorize, which I would then forget through repetition, now took seconds to learn using this method, and I actually remembered them pretty much permanently with very little need for review. I, along with my friend and now business partner Phil, we learned 3,000 characters together in just a few months, working only part-time, about 45 minutes to an hour a day. But here's the real breakthrough, right? I wasn't just memorizing isolated characters. I was building a web of connections that made everything else easier. Words became these logical combinations of characters, now very easy to remember and memorize because I had a deep foundational understanding. How words behaved, i.e. the grammar, started also making a lot more sense. Reading became not just possible, but enjoyable. Inspired by polyglots Benny Lewis and Gabriel Weiner, I also started learning words using mnemonic associations and visualizations too. Instead of just memorizing, for example, that 朋友 means friend, I might create a visual association, maybe imagining a penguin, P-E-N-G, penguin, rapper, yo, right? Giving me a friendly hug. I know it's silly, but it works really, really well. And it takes literally seconds, right? So this experiment taught me that our brains aren't designed to memorize abstract symbols through repetition, but they are incredibly good at remembering people, places, objects, and actions. And when you work with your brain's natural strengths instead of against them, learning becomes not just ridiculously fast, but actually on. Now, as a natural continuation of my experiment with comprehensible input, as I continued building my arsenal of characters and vocabulary, I began listening to and reading lots of Chinese sentences. Now, learning words through example sentences instead of isolated definitions multiplied my progress exponentially. So instead of just memorizing, for example, that 学习 means study, I learned it through sentences like 我每天学习中文 I study Chinese every day. This gave me context, grammar patterns, and real usage all at once. And so as I read and listened to sentence audio every single day, Chinese finally started to click for me, right? The sentences showed me how words behaved in their natural habitat. I could see which words commonly go together, how grammatical structures work in practice, and how native speakers actually express ideas. So this experiment was incredibly successful because it solved multiple problems at once. I was building vocabulary, acquiring grammar naturally, improving my listening skills, and developing a sense for how Chinese really sounds. Instead of learning grammar rules consciously, I was absorbing them subconsciously through repeated exposure to correct patterns, just like I did for English. My brain started to develop an intuitive sense for what sounded right and what didn't. And I naturally started incorporating more long-form content as well, such as podcasts for learners as well as graded readers. I started having more conversations to practice, and I was soon finally able to understand Chinese people and even native content and have real native conversations about topics I cared about. So this is 2 years of total study time at this point, all part-time. After the end of my first year, I was ready to quit, right? I had made barely any progress, I felt. And by the end of my second year, just 12 months later, I was around B2 level fluency and I'd passed the highest level HSK exam, the HK6. But even after this point, I still wasn't done experimenting, right? There's been many more experiments since then. So several years later, I realized that my Chinese had plateaued. I'd been so focused on building Mandarin Blueprint with Phil that I hadn't been actively improving my own Chinese skills for about 5 years. My level had basically stayed the same, maybe even got a bit worse. And so I decided to try a new experiment. I decided to test this pure immersion technique that I heard about so much. I wanted to see if I could improve my Chinese just by consuming massive amount of native content. So I spent at least 2 to 3 hours every day, again, for about a year or so. I would listen to Chinese podcasts primarily, particularly one called 故事 FM, where real Chinese people tell their life stories, right? By the end of this 1 year, I'd invested about 1,000 hours into this immersion experiment. And the conclusion was that immersion is kind of overrated. So don't get me wrong, I'd learned an incredible amount about Chinese culture during this time. I heard real Chinese people talking about their lives, their struggles, their dreams, their relationships. I'd also watched a ton of Chinese TV shows and understood the nuances of certain Chinese high-level advanced vocabulary and how people interact with each other. It reignited my passion, not just for the Chinese language, but for the Chinese culture itself. But in terms of actual language improvement, for the amount of time that I invested, the results were disappointing. So similar to my flashcard obsession years earlier, the level of improvement I saw did not match the effort I put in. It wasn't quite as bad as that, of course, but still it just wasn't satisfactory to me. So this experiment taught me that passive immersion, just watching stuff, just listening to stuff, is a little overrated. Just bathing in the language is not particularly efficient. It's not quite enough if you're not actively engaging with it. You need focused practice, systematic progression, active participation in the learning process. So immersion works best, in my opinion, when it's combined with active techniques, not used as a standalone method. And I'll go into a lot more detail about that now as I talk about my next experiment. So while I was doing my passive immersion experiment, I also tried something called sentence mining. And this wasn't the first time I heard about it. I'd also tried it out before briefly, but I'd really leaned into it this time and done it as it was supposed to be done, right? We're actually extracting sentences from content that I was consuming and turning them into active study materials. So when I would hear a useful phrase or sentence pattern in like a podcast, I would take it out, just copy and paste it. Most podcast apps have like the transcripts there. You can just hit copy and paste. It was quite labor intensive, but I did it anyway, and I made flashcards out of those sentences. I also experimented with a tool called Nagaku. There's also another one I think called LingoPie that help you extract sentences straight out of like YouTube videos and Netflix shows. And it's really quite fun, right? It's far more effective as well than just passive listening or passive watching. So by actively engaging with the content that I was consuming, I was turning immersion into focused practice. For sentence mining, taught me that immersion can be powerful, but only when you make it active. You can't just let the language wash over you and expect to improve with real efficiency. You need to engage with it, extract useful patterns, and practice with them systematically. So as I was doing my immersion and my sentence mining, I thought, you know what, I'll also focus on finding a tutor and going all in on speaking practice. And I wanted to do that in order to increase my spoken fluency. So in my typical fashion, I kind of obsessively dove into hiring tutors and testing them out. I had demos with 50 different tutors on italki. I did demo sessions with all of them and eventually settled on 5 of these 50 that I really liked. But here's what I learned from spending all that money and time. Even the best tutors, again, aren't going to help you improve your fluency with any measurable systematic efficiency. So let me explain. So first, good tutors who really gel with you are incredibly hard to find, right? It's like hiring a good employee. You have to interview quite a lot of people to find that one person who's really right for the job. And even highly rated tutors on the platform might not be a good fit for your learning style or your personality. Second, even when you find great tutors, the return on investment often isn't there. You end up just having the same types of conversations, using the same vocabulary over and over. Sometimes tutors, I would find they would start off really good at trying hard, but as we just sort of had lesson after lesson together, they would gradually get more and more lazy and just worse and worse. I would often make the same speaking mistakes repeatedly, and there was no systematic way to track what I was struggling with or to ensure that I was making progress on my weak points, right? So most tutors, even the good ones, don't really have a structured curriculum. They just wing it. They have conversations and they hope you'll improve through exposure, but that's not systematic improvement. So this experiment taught me that native speakers are not the most efficient path to improving your speaking ability. They are great and crucial, in fact, for cultural insights and correcting your pronunciation and providing real conversation practice, real connection with native speakers of the language, but they're not necessarily the best teachers or the most systematic way to build your speaking skill. Now, my final 2 experiments taught me what really leads to efficient fluency. While I was in my year-long immersion kick, I started really leaning into a technique called shadowing along with my sentence mining. This is where you speak along with native Chinese audio, like you're kind of dubbing a movie, right? So you try to match the speaker's rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation as closely as you possibly can. Now, I had tried shadowing throughout my time learning Chinese, but I'd never done it consistently. So every day for about a year or so, while walking my dogs, I would spend 15 minutes or so shadowing. I invested about 100 hours or so. I was shadowing Chinese with a wide range of content, from individual sentences to podcasts to audiobooks to TV shows and movies, whatever content I was consuming during my immersion experiment. The results were pretty interesting. So shadowing transformed my speaking fluency and pronunciation in ways I didn't expect. It trained my mouth muscles to produce Chinese sounds more naturally, and it helped me internalize the rhythm and flow of the language. And before doing shadowing consistently, I could speak Chinese, but sometimes it felt mechanical, awkward. My mouth would get tired and my tones and my general pronunciation would get worse and worse as a conversation went on, which you may know what I'm talking about watching this. But after a year of shadowing practice, my Chinese started to flow more naturally. I didn't get tired when I was speaking. I could consistently have better rhythm and tones and pronunciation overall, which is better. And I felt much more comfortable producing Chinese sounds at speed. But here's what I learned throughout this experiment, and not just my own experiment running this, but also as I've been working with our coaching clients on shadowing specifically. Random content is inefficient. So for most of that year, I was shadowing random podcasts, random audiobooks, and it was helpful, but it wasn't optimal. So shadowing seemed to work better when I would use high quality individual sentences, right, containing the most common words and phrases, words that I actually wanted to be able to say in real conversations. So when shadowing content that's directly useful to you, you're not just improving your pronunciation, you're also reinforcing very important key vocabulary and grammar patterns that you'll actually use like immediately in day-to-day life. So since testing out with our coaching clients as well, we've realized it's incredibly important to actually really try and maintain focus on understanding what you're shadowing and not just sort of mindlessly shadow, which is a very easy habit to fall into. So it's better to shadow, in my opinion, slower to more useful, targeted sentence-based content. And this experiment taught me that shadowing is incredibly powerful, but like everything else, it needs to be done strategically to get the best results. Now, while shadowing did make speaking easier, it didn't have a huge effect on the quality of my output, as in my level of spoken proficiency and actual fluency in terms of my command of the Chinese language. Right. So shadowing is more like akin to strength and conditioning training or stretching. It hones your tools. It allows you to produce Chinese more like a native speaker in terms of pronunciation, speed, your overall just comfort with the language. But in terms of actually speaking fluently, expressing your thoughts at speed, producing the language fluently and accurately in real time, nothing was quite as effective as what I learned in my most recent and most powerful experiment of all. I'm talking about something called retrieval practice or active recall. It's quite simple, really. It's just about producing Chinese from a thought, a feeling, or some kind of prompt or English translation, just speaking Chinese, basically. But there are easier and harder ways to do it. So it can be done through simply talking to yourself, narrating your environment, expressing how you feel, making a short journal in Chinese, depending on your level. It can also be done with the help of AI. You could ask AI to ask you questions based on a bunch of topics or sentences you've been practicing with. Or my favorite way, it can also be done using flashcards. So instead of putting Chinese on the front of a flashcard and English on the back, which only really tests recognition, it's not a very useful way of using SRS flashcards. Instead, I flipped it around. So English on the front, Chinese on the back. I had to produce the Chinese from the English translation, basically from memory, instead of just recognizing the Chinese. So I created hundreds of flashcards with sentences that I actually found useful that I wanted to say. I used AI to generate the audio for me, and I'd look at the English and try to produce the Chinese before checking my answer. It was brutal at first, but after 90 days or so of this practice, I could produce hundreds of these Chinese sentences instantly from English prompts. And this was far more effective than just random conversations with tutors because the flashcard system kept track of everything I got wrong and naturally focused my practice on the weak points. It was systematic, measurable, and incredibly efficient. Now, I originally thought that this would only allow me to accurately produce the specific sentences I was learning, but that's not actually what happened. And it also made me better at producing Chinese in general. And since working with our coaching clients on this, we've had them do active recall for their sentences. And they've also found that mastering a couple of hundred sentences doesn't just make them good at, regurgitating the Chinese for those sentences. It also just makes them good at all the grammar structures and vocabulary that those sentences contain. And they can just go ahead and create their own sentences from scratch in a much more natural and much more speedy way. And that makes sense if you think about it, because there's only a certain number of grammar structures in the Chinese language. And if you can use certain groups of sentences to master those grammar structures, as long as you can grow your vocabulary, you can just slot in that new vocabulary where it's needed. And then you can go ahead and produce brand new sentences from scratch in real time. So after all these experiments, let me just give you a quick summary of what actually works, in my opinion, based on all these years of trial and error. Listen, repeat training is great for pronunciation. Highly recommended. And ideally, doing this early on is one of the first things you do when you start out learning Chinese or any language. Second, memory techniques for characters and words, right? Use memory palaces to learning Chinese characters and use mnemonics for learning words. There's simply no better method that I'm aware of. And do not do rote learning. Just learning without thinking about it, without connecting to the information. Third, learn through example sentences, ideally not isolated definitions. Now, you might have to do that when you first start out. You don't have enough vocabulary to actually understand a sentence. But if you master the most common, say 1,000 or so words, that covers about 80% of the language, then you can move on to example sentences from there. And then from then on, you can actually learn new words from example sentences. And then later on, of course, more long form content and eventually native content designed for natives. Next, the importance of active recall or retrieval practice, producing Chinese from thoughts, feelings, prompts, questions, whatever it is. Another key takeaway, targeted shadowing with, again, high value, relevant, comprehensible sentences. Active immersion with 100% focus, ideally combined with sentence mining, is very, very effective as well. Doing passive listening, can definitely help. It will improve your listening ability. More passive activities like just reading and listening are also very important. It will definitely help, but they're not going to help you produce the language fluently as effectively as active recall and retrieval practice will. Avoid traditional textbooks, classrooms, tutors. That kind of format is very outdated. It's very inefficient and expensive. Avoid consciously studying grammar rules. If you feel you really must consciously understand the grammar rule, you can go ahead and look it up, but just know that it's not going to necessarily lead to you being able to fluently use that grammar point or that grammar structure in real time. And I guess a final takeaway from all these experiments is that there definitely are shortcuts to fluency, but the things that actually work are challenging to do. But if you have the right guidance, the right coach, the right course to guide you through it, it can be definitely manageable and you'll be very satisfied with the results. And on the flip side, there are definitely wrong turns that you can take that will waste years of your life. Even if you search Google for the best methods, the ones that pop up at the top of the results can be some of the worst choices you could make as a Chinese learner. Really, the methods that work require effort. They're not always fun every minute of the day. They might not give you that instant gratification or 500-day streaks, but they work and they work fast if you stick to them consistently. And so once again, if you want to skip all this painful trial and error that I went through, if you want to use methods that are actually proven to work, click the link in the description to join our free course and community. You'll get access to the exact techniques that transform my Chinese without all the frustration and wasted time. But with that said, knowing what works is kind of only half the battle. The other half is actually being able to speak when you have to, when you need to, right? So if you've ever frozen up in a conversation or felt like your mind just goes blank when trying to speak Chinese, this next video will show you exactly why that happens and how to fix it.